So next we're going to move on to our study and report item, Hiawatha Golf Course Water Management Alternatives Assessment, and please, Tyler Pedersen, Design Project Manager, take it away. And thank you for waiting until 8 p.m.
Hey, last but not least, right?
Yes.
Let's see. Okay. Good evening, co-chairs Elper and Abeni and committee members. Tonight I will present the water assessment for Hiawatha Golf Course up to about August 2017. And in a few weeks from today, I'll continue with the presentation of the master plan. Prior to 1929, Rice Lake and its wetland complex extended well into the existing neighborhoods we know today in South Minneapolis. As the city grew, lakes were dredged and wetlands were filled. And to quote David C. Smith out of our City of Parks book, the city created some of them, lakes, from wetlands long before wetlands were appreciated for the role they play in the ecosystem. In 1929, Theodore Wirth entirely changed the landscape and ecosystem of Rice Lake wetland complex by dredging its eastern half and filling its western half. What wildlife was left would have been scrambling to reestablish itself in an almost uninhabitable space. No rice, for which the lake was named at that time, remained. A decade later, there is no shoreline, just a limestone wall at its edge. Some of it is still seen today below the surface of the water. A decade later, excuse me, I just read that. At the time, this was progressive, and it happened all over the city as the city grew. It is worth saying, however, Theodore Wirth brought unprecedented access to parkland to Minneapolis residents, and it's why the MPRB is often named the best park system in the U.S. Though we are blessed by Theodore Wirth's efforts to expand the park system, we have a lot of work to do to align it with our current needs and conditions. Over the past decade, the MPRB has master planned every park in our system, or currently doing so at Cedar Lake, and recently adopted the Parks for All comprehensive plan and ecological system plans. The direction from our partners, stakeholders, and public is clear. Parks must be ecologically driven and sustainable. Park design practices of the past are no longer wholly aligned with that goal. When the golf course flooded in 2014, it raised the question, how can we keep the golf course ecologically sustainable, flood resilient, and in turn, fiscally sustainable? As the master plan effort began in 2015, the design team strived to answer that question. Flooding of the property underscored the risks involved in operating the golf course at this unique site in an era of climate change. At the time, it was understood that the two large pumps transferred the city's stormwater from a 70-acre neighborhood area laying west of the golf course and transferring it to the lake. Knowing we wanted to minimize the risk of flooding and create a resilient golf course, we dove into the master planning effort. That is, until September 2015, when the design team learned the stormwater pumps were in fact pumping groundwater to Lake Hiawatha, estimated at the time to be about 263 million gallons annually. The design team paused the master planning process to focus on this new information and what it meant for the park property and the surrounding neighborhood. The MPRB applied for a permit to pump groundwater to come into compliance with state law. Prior to our planning effort in the park, looking to square away permits for pumping, prior to our planning effort in the park, we had a permit for 36.5 million gallons of water to pump from Pond E for irrigation. and another 2 million gallons per year were allowed for irrigation, supplemental irrigation, which draws from a deep well. And then no permit was required for pumping stormwater from Pond E to the lake. To move MPRB into compliance, we applied for and received a new permit to pump up to 308 million gallons of groundwater per year from Pond E. That maximum number has now since increased to 400 million gallons per year. The new permit does have a condition that requires the MPRB to notify the DNR of its plans for dewatering the golf course by August 15, 2023. The MPRB, City of Minneapolis, and the Minnehaha Creek Watershed District entered into a cooperative agreement which allowed the three agencies to work together to understand the site's complex issues. Our goals moving forward at that time were to develop concepts to restore or reconfigure the golf course if pumping continues, or to imagine other park configurations if pumping stops. Also to improve ecology of the creek through the golf course property, consider options for the pipe from 43rd Street on the north side of the park that empties into Lake Hiawatha, and then understand fully the potential groundwater impacts on nearby private properties if pumping stops. In the fall of 2015, the MPRB expanded the scope of the design team's work to now focus on water. The pumping of groundwater and stormwater study was broken down into two phases. The first phase assessed the hydrologic conditions of the site. The MPRB, City, and Watershed hosted 3 public meetings and a neighbor-specific meeting which focused on basement inundation of nearby homes. Meters were installed on the 2 larger Pond E pumps to understand current flow to the lake from the pond. Monitoring wells were installed to monitor groundwater conditions. Water quality sampling was conducted. A short-term recovery test of the 2 pumps for a short time was conducted to better understand the rate of pond water level recovery. And we looked at historic water conditions, and we developed a stormwater model. Then all this information was compiled and peer-reviewed by Dr. Otto Strock, a professor of civil engineering and geological engineering at the University of Minnesota. The second phase of work commenced in early 2017 and took all data and facts produced in the first phase and formed water management alternatives. 4 well-attended public meetings were held with the community. Several pumping scenarios and water management alternatives were developed which helped anticipate groundwater pumping and ecological goals. The alternatives also included a cursory look at what uses might be aligned with each. When the water management alternatives were assembled, the design team dug into an assessment of the impacts each alternative may have, and they looked at several impacts, including surface and stormwater flooding, pumping and regional groundwater, water quality, ecological impacts, recreational impacts, economic, transportation, environmental, cultural review. And then a sustainability and benefit cost analysis was conducted using the ISI Envision process and AutoCase method. And finally, the phase resulted in a preferred water management solution. Phase 1 and 2 deliverables included 5 technical memoranda and an executive summary in early and mid-2017. The Phase 1 technical memo assembled the facts, including the level of pumping at about 242 million gallons of groundwater pumped annually from Pond E. 40% of the inflow is from Lake Hiawatha. 60% of the inflow is from regional shallow groundwater, and 66 million gallons of stormwater are pumped annually. Phosphorus conditions in the pond, ground, and lake water are similar at the time of the study. Most phosphorus enters the lake from the storm sewers and the creek, which are vastly larger areas than the golf course property. And there's no interaction between shallow groundwater and deep groundwater aquifers, meaning there is no impact by the current pumping regime to those aquifers. So we asked ourselves what might happen if we turned the pumps off. We conducted a recovery test where 2 of the pumps were turned off for a short time and measured how quickly the pond level rose and fell. We concluded that if the pumps were turned off, groundwater would rise from below the property and equalize with the level of the lake. About 18 neighboring basements may be at risk from groundwater inundation rising from below ground. Large areas of the property would be inundated, and even larger areas would be saturated to the point of being unusable. Each of the pumping scenarios indicated that the best course of action is to continue pumping until a new solution is implemented. We also asked ourselves if we could lower the level of the lake to reduce pumping. And generally the answer is no. Throughout the process, members of the community insisted that dredging of the lake or removing of the weir at the lake outlet would lower the lake level, but these ideas are not feasible. Dredging into the water table may increase the water body's volume, but be quickly filled with groundwater, making no change in the lake level. And then the top crest of the weir at the lake outlet is underwater, rendering it useless and not an impediment to flow. The option the design team did look closely at was to actually lower the creek bed about 2,000 linear feet of the creek bed to lower the lake about a foot. This was determined infeasible due to several large utilities just under the bed of the creek, one of them being about a 10-foot by 10-foot box tunnel conveying regional wastewater to St. Paul, which is a very large, almost immovable object. So moving from phase 1 to 2 allowed us to develop several pumping scenarios. I won't go through the detail here, but it's just to show you how complex and what we looked at for about 15 initial pumping scenarios. Then the pumping scenarios were merged into 7 water management alternatives, and the alternatives were modeled, and several results or impacts were generated for each. Of those 7 alternates, 2 were chosen to bring before the Board of Commissioners. Alternate A it's not an existing condition, even though it sort of looks like it. It maintains the current pumping rates, maintains the 18-hole golf course, and implements previously identified improvements, protects nearby basements to the degree they're protected today, reduces flooding in the watershed to the north, and has no impact on the watershed to the west. It allows for trash mitigation and has limited opportunity to increase water quality treatment. Alternative B eliminates the need for stormwater pumping and reduces groundwater pumping, protects nearby basements to the degree they're protected today, reduces flooding in the watershed to the north and has no impact on the watershed to the west, changes recreational use of the land, provides opportunity to restore ecological function and develop habitat. It allows for trash mitigation. It maximizes the opportunity for water quality treatment and allows for the realignment of Minnehaha Creek to a historic location. Alternate A maintains the current pumping level at the time of the study, it was about 308 million gallons per year. It has since risen to about 400 now. It has a much larger cone of depression compared to that of alternative B because the pumping location near the lake is further from the neighborhood and lower in elevation. In alternative B, the pumping is moved nearer the neighborhood and designed specifically for the task of lowering groundwater below the homes. Alternative A is not an existing condition. There are several elements that need to be modified or updated to make it function, and this is evident in the cost analysis I'll show you in a minute. When we compare landscape types with each alternative, B has a better distribution and balance than A, and A has a very large area, as A has a very large area dedicated to managed turf. On either side, you can just simply tell there's a better distribution of landscape types and more landscape types with B. So alternative A is dominated by the 18-hole golf course, which limits the maximum number of people who can use the space at once. And alternative B was estimated to allow for over twice as many users and several more uses. Just to the upper right-hand side of each of the diagrams are just a list of some of the uses. There's several more in B, making it much more diverse. Moving on to Envision. So the two alternates were run through ISI Envision's sustainability framework, which allows for the quantification of various sustainability drivers so that they can both be compared. The 5 categories for Envision rating system are climate risk, natural world, resource allocation, leadership, and quality of life. Out of 122 possible points, alternative A reached 68 and B reached 111, mainly due to the differences in diversity of uses and landscapes. The higher the number, the more sustainable the alternative. The Envision framework helped deliver infrastructure that tackles climate change, addresses public health needs, cultivates environmental justice, creates jobs, and spurs economic recovery. Next is cost comparisons using AutoCase and the triple bottom line. It not only looks at revenue generated versus capital and operating costs, but also several social and environmental considerations to truly bring sustainability to the project. And it's quantified here. Alternative A may cost slightly less. However, when we look at the two with the triple bottom line in mind, we see alternative B as a better value, especially with social and environmental benefits. The design team then presented information similar to what you've heard tonight to the board on August 9th, 2017. And the design team, the city, the watershed together recommended water management alternative B. And that evening, the board approved Resolution 2017-243, following the recommendation from staff. And that resolution directed staff to apply for a groundwater appropriation permit from the DNR aligned with a reduced pumping scenario, and to amend the regional park master plan to accommodate changes to the property made necessary by the reduced groundwater pumping scenario. And that with that direction from the board, we were then able to widen the focus of our work to that of a master plan scope, which looks far beyond just water resources. And in about 3 weeks, you'll learn a lot more about that process and its outcomes, so stay tuned. And that's all I have for you.
Thank you. All right, so let's see what questions we've got from commissioners. I see Commissioner Thompson.
So thank you for that. As the commissioner who represents the north side of Minneapolis, I have heard from many people that revisiting this so early into the new tenure of all the new board would almost feel like a betrayal. And so I'm curious as to why we're being presented this now.
Co-chairs and commissioners, and Commissioner Thompson, that's a really good question. One of the things we haven't focused on is some of the discussion that's been going on between the DNR and the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. And those two agencies have a significant interest in the DNR for a much longer period, the MPCA even more recently. And late last year, we had communication from the MPCA indicating that they wanted us to demonstrate what we're doing to resolve issues of trash flow into the lake and impairment based on largely on the inflow of phosphorus into the lake. Lake Hiawatha is listed as an impaired lake, and the Park Board and the City of Minneapolis are responsible for that lake through our joint MS4 permitting, which, by the way, is due in it expires in about a year from now. We met with the with the MPCA just last week after they wrote a letter saying they wanted us to explain how we're going to start addressing some of the issues that were raised during this part of the analysis and in the master plan. And it was clear that they're taking their capacity for regulating trash and other things into the lake seriously. So we need to have a plan of action. The best plan of action we have right now is this master plan. As we discussed, the benefits of the master plan, which they are extremely familiar with, it was clear that they wanted us to be taking some action and not continuing to delay any kind of an action. We haven't had that same kind of sense of urgency from the DNR, although in separate discussions, I know they're anxious for us to get to a conclusion so we can demonstrate what we're doing, what we'll be doing in the long term with the pumping. So we realize that it's early in this board's tenure, but we are getting pressure from regulating agencies to take some action.
Thank you. May I ask a follow-up question on that? Are you aware of at all the DNR pressuring other agencies, upstream of the Minnehaha watershed, all those kind of things, or even the city? Because I think we all can agree in this room that a lot of this stuff has fallen onto parks when it is a much larger water issue in terms of the Minnehaha Creek watershed as it drains into the Mississippi. So I'm curious if you know of any of that, or if the DNR is just pressuring us.
Co-chairs and commissioners, I wouldn't say that the DNR is pressuring us relative to inflows from other communities. Their particular interest here is related to the groundwater that's being pumped and not the surface waters that are coming in. So the pressure isn't coming from the DNR. When we look at the water that flows through pipes and enters into the lakes, and that's directly the responsibility of the Park Board and the City of Minneapolis, there are two watershed areas that would be of concern. There's about a 70-acre watershed to the west, and that's the water that's pumped from Pond E and into Lake Hiawatha. The other is about a 900-acre watershed that stretches all the way to Lake Street, and that's the one that is probably more problematic relative to trash and other inflows into the lake. It runs through the 43rd Street pipe, it turns to the south and enters directly and untreated into Lake Hiawatha. And I think that's the greater concern of the MPCA.
And one more follow-up question, and is that pipe and is that ours or is it the city's?
The commissioners, that pipe belongs to the City of Minneapolis. The pipe that runs through the golf course is also the responsibility of the City of Minneapolis. However, together we are responsible for the flows into the lakes and streams of Minneapolis through the MS4 permit.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Thompson. All right, let's go to my co-chair, Aveni.
Thank you, Co-Chair Elper. Just also a comment to catch the ear of Commissioner Thompson. There are a lot of, we had a couple of people speak tonight. There's also a lot of other voices of people that are advocating for the natural environment in that location, and the work that's been done of citizens for many, many years to clean up that water, pick up the 10,000 pounds of trash is what they're estimating now. And so I know I've been hearing from people too, and I think others probably have as well. So so I think bringing this up now, and especially with a new board and in a sensitive way, understanding that there might be a little bit more urgency coming from the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency on the park board deciding how it's going to approach this is important. And I think hearing the discussion, trying to just really hear this is a complicated situation with the water, and really trying to just learn and take that in, and maybe, you know, just as its own topic, I think is important to framing this decision. So anyway, I appreciate the presentation very much, and I understand the complexity of this situation, so thank you.
All right, I have to review who's on the committee, just a minute. Okay. I'm going to go to Commissioner Olson first.
Yeah, just one comment first. I appreciate that you start at, you know, the natural history of this land and kind of go into what is almost the original sin of development and the idea of progress, which we certainly benefited in some ways, but we're also paying the tax and the consequences in some ways. So I do appreciate that full holistic outlook of what we're doing here. This is just a side question. So you said most of the phosphorus comes from not the golf course, but outside. Is that from personal use? People using fertilizer on their lawn and the such, or?
Co-chairs and commissioners, it would be difficult from the information we have to tell exactly where it's coming from, but we do track the amount of fertilizers that are used on the golf course. The golf staff monitors that very carefully, and it's by inference we can determine that most of it is coming from off-site and not from on-site. When we look at what the off-site sources are, typically they're private lawns.
All right, well, maybe that's a legislative thing in the future. I don't know. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Commissioner Metz?
Thank you, Commissioner Alper. I'm not on this committee, but I appreciate the opportunity to ask a question. I have two questions. How many lakes in our system are impaired? I heard that 1/4 of lakes in Minnesota. I'm wondering how many of ours are impaired? And also, why do we think that the amount of water being pumped has increased so much so quickly? I don't know if I heard that answer.
Co-chairs and commissioners, we'd have to talk to our environmental management staff to figure out what number of our lakes are impaired. I know that Deb Pilger and Rachel Crabb and their staff monitor that, so we can get that information for you. The second, can you repeat your second question?
Why do we think it's increased from 300 to 400 million gallons a year?
So,
it seems like it would be consistent, but.
So in the information that was sent out, I believe we sent a link to a presentation that the state climatologist Kenneth Blumenthal made. And we had him presenting, he actually talked to our design group, and I believe he also made a presentation to the board, which you had access to see. And at the time he was making his presentation, he was talking about climate change and what was going on with essentially precipitation, and that in the period that he was looking at, I can't remember if at that time it was, we had 7 years of rain in 6 years or something like that, a significant amount of additional rainfall. Working with the watershed district, the city, the county, the Metropolitan Council, USGS, watershed districts, I'm trying to think who else, DNR. Those agencies work together to try and better understand groundwater. It was part of, as Tyler was saying, we put some monitoring wells in so we could better understand groundwater interactions on the site. We also put groundwater monitoring wells in Solomon Park, and we were relying on groundwater wells even farther away to try and understand what was going on with groundwater. And it's important that we make a distinction about what's being pumped here, because the volume of pumping that we're doing at the 242 million gallons, which is what we started at, is enough water to take care of the domestic water needs of a small to medium-sized Minnesota town. That's a lot of groundwater. And groundwater levels moving through this part of Minneapolis have been increasing on the order of several inches a year, most likely because of the greater amount of precipitation. So some of it runs off, some is absorbed into the ground and becomes groundwater. That's the flow that's coming through. So we did a considerable amount of study to understand what was going on with groundwater, determined that it actually was increasing in levels below the ground, that there probably was a whole lot more than there was certainly when the golf course was built, which was happening during an extended drought. And even understanding some of the bedrock geology to understand why some of the water might not be flowing past the golf course, or might be essentially being blocked up behind the golf course on the upstream side of the golf course. And that's the result, as we understand, of a bedrock ridge that limits the flow of water to going through, and so it essentially backs it up on the upstream side. By the way, I'll note that the Watershed District has been working for probably a year and a half on what they call the white paper. And you'll have benefit of the white paper probably within the next month. And it's an in-depth study of groundwater and other interactions in this part of Minneapolis. And it's a significant in-depth study that helps recognize that the things that are going on at Lake Hiawatha are maybe not directly tied to other problems that are going on for neighbors' homes in the neighborhood. And we can review that with you as you get that document in a month or so.
Great, thanks. Before I go to you, Co-Chair Benny, can I ask a couple questions? And then I'll come back to you, Commissioner Musich. You mentioned the 18 basements that risk inundation from groundwater, and can you just walk me through it? How does the preferred alternative impact the risk of water in people's basements? Because I know that's a concern, and I just want to dispel any myths out there with the preferred alternative.
Sure. Co-Chair Alper. To begin with, we have to go back to what this area was before the golf course was created and before the homes were built. It was a wetland. Real estate speculators came in during a period of extremely dry weather, built homes. They were built on wetland soils, so we've discovered through this process and talking with neighbors that neighbors have homes that are built on wood piles that hold the walls up. We've also discovered that people have found that as they've, for instance, decided to put a bathroom in their basement and a plumber would come to cut a hole in the floor, that the ground would actually be several feet below the underside of the slab of the concrete. So, and we've heard other stories of basements collapsing for the same reason. When, as the groundwater is pumped out, it draws water out of the soil and the soil subsides. It's also, and it's one of the things that maybe we should have focused a little more on the presentation. When Worth originally dredged the soils from the Rice Lake and placed them on the area of the golf course, they probably started at an elevation that was higher than the lake. What's happened over time is those soils have subsided. The lake has stayed probably the same, maybe has risen a little bit, but now probably half of the golf course or more is under the elevation, the normal elevation of the water.
Could you show that map with the location of the pump?
Yeah, and while Tyler finds that, I will explain as best I can the concept of a cone of depression. So if we're pumping from a well, it's drawing water out of the soils from an area around it, and it creates a very large, in the case of the existing Pond E, it creates a very large cone of depression that essentially dewaters the whole of the golf course and extends across the street to nearby homes, to the 18 or so homes that are impacted. So we have a cone of depression that's this big because we have to dewater under the whole golf course. If our goal is not to dewater the golf course and only the homes, we don't have to dewater from a point that's relatively low, near the lake elevation or even below the lake elevation. We can move it closer to the street and higher, and we now have a much smaller cone of depression because we're only trying to capture on the surface those homes that are impacted. So in the case, what we'll be looking at would be a solution that instead of pumping from a single point, actually uses a system of linear pumps running along so that they're much shallower and we can reduce the amount of groundwater being pumped significantly and be assured that we can pump that water to a point where it protects the homes to the same degree we are protecting them today. Technically, we are not protecting them. They're benefiting from the pumping that's going on. But as we moved into this, we didn't want to put a home at risk. And so our water management solutions strive to find a way to protect the homes to the same degree as a kind of a byproduct of the pumping we were doing.
Great, thanks for that information. And then just one more time, just so that we understand the gravitas of the situation, the amount allowed through our permit that we're allowed to pump of groundwater versus the amount that we're actually pumping. Do you mind repeating that one more time?
So when we started in this, the amount of groundwater that was being pumped, the total amount of groundwater being appropriated was the 36.5 million plus 2 million gallons more, so 38.5 million, and an appropriations permit for 36.5 million, which allowed us to irrigate the golf course. What we're pumping now, what we pumped last year, is closer to 400 million gallons. And that's essentially a different kind of permit. That's a dewatering permit. And essentially, we're pumping the 400 million gallons to keep the golf course and the nearby homes dry.
Great, thank you so much. Commissioner Musich, please go ahead.
Thank you for allowing me to speak on your committee. Commissioner Alper, I'm not on this committee, but I appreciate the opportunity to speak. When the board was initially considering the reducing of pumping in this location, we were told that there's precedent for the park board taking legal action to stop dewatering of the kind in which we were ourselves engaged in. Could you brief this body and its current composition on that situation and that history as well, please?
Co-chairs and Commissioner Musich, actually, it was before my time, but I believe Council Rice would have been here and can probably speak to the issue at Lake and Knox.
Yes, I was just hoping you could bring this board up to speed on previous legal actions that the Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board has taken to prevent dewatering, being the dewatering of groundwater and pumping into lakes.
Yes, we did. The board, if I can get back, it was Lake and Knox. There was a construction of a building on Lake and Knox, and they built a basement, but they didn't enclose the basement. So they were pumping water from the basement, the ground, it was the groundwater, and they were putting it into the chain of lakes without any permit, either from the city or us or anyone. And so that was, we joined an action that the city had, or we might have even started the action and the city joined us to require the pumping to end.
And the outcome of that was?
The outcome of that was the, trying to remember, you're testing my memory. The outcome of that was that the builder of the property had to put a basement sleeve. They had to, like every house has, a concrete waterproof basement in their building instead of just an open hole into the ground.
So the dewatering ceased ultimately?
They stopped pumping any water into the creek.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, any further questions first? Oh, yes, yes, thank you for waiting. Commissioner Co-Chair Benny.
I just wanted to comment because, and actually you said it just now, Assistant Superintendent Schroeder, about this was a wetland. And this, this, not only wouldn't this be allowed to be built now based on the 1991 Wetlands Conservation Act and other acts even before that about filling wetlands in, but it would also just not be a practice that anyone would pursue because of all the problems with soils, their compressibility over time, that are traditional wetland soils. And so to me, I think it's really important to remember before, the European settlement, as it's called, or pre-settlement, this was a very different looking area than what we have today. And it's really resisting our man-made interventions here. So I just wanted to comment on that. Thank you.
Let's see, any other committee members before? Oh, yep, I'm going to do that and then I'll do a second round with Commissioner Thompson. So
Sure. I have,
Commissioner Schaefer, please go ahead.
I'm trying to get a sense of visually, there's a lot of trees that we'll lose probably with the wetland eventually taking over kind of that center area. I don't know what that number would be. And then I'm trying to understand how we maintain the wetland from encroaching on the Gulf holes that would be left. We've all seen what wetlands can do and how they move and how they change. And so do we anticipate costs with that process, or what's the strategy?
So, co-chairs and commissioners, I think we'll get into much more detail on that when we can present the master plan to you, because we employed strategies according to the directive of the board to create a flood-resistant and ecologically sustainable golf course that would be at least 9 holes as we went through the master planning process. So we can explain that better next time, because we'll have better graphics and we can explain it. But I think one thing you're pointing out is important, and we didn't highlight that here either. With the golf course being 40 or 50% or more below the elevation of the lake, it's also largely within the 10-year flood event. So we have a 1 in 10 chance of this golf course, of large portions of the golf course flooding every year. When it did flood in 2014, the berm prevented the water. We couldn't get the water out. The water would either seep back in. We couldn't get the water out of the golf course. So it was essentially a bathtub that was undrainable. And it stayed that way for 2 or 3 months, significantly impacting the tree resources on the golf course. I don't remember how many trees we lost, but we did a survey. There were several hundred trees that were lost as a result of that particular storm event, which was significantly beyond the 10-year event. But the 10-year event could happen, basically it's a 1 in 10 chance every year. As we move forward in the master plan, we'll be demonstrating this. We have attempted to elevate the more precious resources of the golf course above the 10-year flood elevation. So we would actually have a more sustainable golf course, and one that would be ready to play more quickly after the 10-year rain event.
And just one more question around, and I think this will come out in the master plan and when you share this, but how does the 900 acres that are draining into Lake Hiawatha, how does the lake health of Lake Hiawatha intersect with, they seem like they're a little bit of 2 different things we're trying to hit.
Co-chairs and commissioners, you're getting into the crux of all of this. As we got into this, we realized that this wasn't just a groundwater pumping issue. There were so many issues that were coming together here. And what we tried to do with the master plan is find a way to provide the proper balance between recreation and environmental ecological response. And what we recognized is that we could be taking significant actions to increase the health of Lake Hiawatha through the changes that would happen at the golf course, whether it would be the removal of trash, removal of phosphorus, just providing more riparian habitat, any number of things that would increase the kind of natural diversity. In fact, as I would talk to people about this, what we were trying to do in a way, and this is a very lofty goal and probably seems a bit of hubris to even suggest it, but we were trying to reestablish the ecology of Rice Lake, which had, even though it was a very shallow, marshy lake, it had ecologic integrity. We don't have that anymore. And a lot of what we're trying to do is find ways, as best we can, to restore that kind of ecologic integrity of the system. And it will rely on not just things that we can do here on the golf course property, but in talking with Commissioner Benny, ensuring that the city does all it can do in the upstream pipe sheds to minimize what's actually coming onto the property, to allow us to do an even better job with the waters that are flowing through the golf course property and into the lake and creek.
Great. Thank you, Commissioner Schaefer. I saw Commissioner Olson's light on. No? Okay. Okay. All right. Let's go to Commissioner Thompson.
And thank you, Co-Chair Alper. I know I'm not on this committee, and you've given me a lot of airtime, so I appreciate that. Mostly it's because I want to get ahead of this for my constituents. So I just have a couple of questions that came up. Have we ever done a study of the impact if we simply fixed that 43rd Street pipe and got it filtered and pulled the trash out that's coming from the city into Lake Hiawatha, like what that would do?
Co-chairs and commissioners. In fact, Commissioner Thompson, that's where we started. Tyler was saying that after the floods in 2014, we were in a master planning process to begin to understand how we might improve the golf courses. At the time, we had some dollars that we could be directing through this through the FEMA award. So we were looking at that. And one of the things that we looked at most directly was a way to take that 43rd Street pipe, which runs across the north side of the golf course, and redirect it through what we call an open channel condition. And I don't want people to think negatively what an open channel is. But essentially, instead of having a pipe from the northwest corner of the golf course, it would flow overland and into the lake. And that would significantly change the character of the flow of that pipe. It's actually a very flat pipe along 43rd Street. It sediments quickly and has the potential, because it retains water, to encourage bacterial growth and other things that are not healthy for the lake. In fact, one of the things we intended to do was to put flow meters in that pipe so that we could understand how much water is actually coming through it. It was so sedimented that we couldn't even get flow meters. We were told not even to bother putting flow meters in because they wouldn't get accurate readings with the amount of sediment in the pipe.
So to be clear, nobody's fixed that pipe.
So
Us or the city, and we've not. That's not.
When we told the city about the sedimentation of the pipe, they did clean it. My guess is that it sediments rather quickly again because the water is coming in. The sediments will drop out when the water slows down, and it's slowing down significantly in a flat pipe.
Thank you. And then my second question is just for comparison's sake. It's all well and good to talk about the golf course being on a wetland. Let's be real, this is the state of Minnesota. The entire state is a wetland until you get up north. So how many gallons do we pump for Lake of the Isles? Do you guys have numbers on that?
Co-chairs and commissioners, I'm not aware that we actually pump water in Lake of the Isles.
So when we've had flooding over there, what has mitigated that?
So the chain of lakes were, again, going back to Worth, the chain of lakes, Cedar Lake, Lake of the Isles, and Bedamakaska, the water elevation was equalized and the lakes were connected. So right now, a drop of water that comes into Cedar Lake at the upstream end would eventually flow out through a pipe at the southerly end of Bedamakaska and into Harriet. So water that's
and then in turn into the Minnehaha Creek watershed.
Right, it moves through Hiawatha or through Lake Harriet and then through a channel into the creek.
And into
So the way water gets out of Lake of the Isles is through the lagoon, through Bedamakaska, and then finally out that pipe. And it's controlled by the ability of that pipe to accommodate flows, not by pumping.
Thank you. So what would be needed to be pumped from Lake of the Isles, because it is also a wetland, ends up ultimately flowing into Hiawatha.
That's correct.
Yes.
And you'll see in the master plan, one of the major moves that the master plan made was to try and restore that same kind of ecology to the flows, where it's not being pumped, where stormwater comes in or rainwater comes in, and it can find its way more naturally into the lake, the creek, and then the river.
Thank you. And thank you again, Co-Chair.
Absolutely. Okay, Commissioner Schaefer, I see your light's still on. Okay. Any further questions on this? Okay, well, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And with that, I declare the meeting adjourned.